Welcome everybody to above. Well, we were thinking, what could we do this evening? There's 2 hours left. It's been a long fast. It's been a hot fast. What can we do to inspire? What can we do to feel the horror and the destruction, the pain of the Beis Hamikdash? What can we do to feel the history of the Jewish people? So we were investigating different speakers, different options, and I spoke to my good friend and colleague, Rabbi Rafi Garson, and he said to me, you have to bring Manfred Goldberg. He is one of the best speakers, one of the best people you can bring on a Tisha B'Av who will inspire, who can speak about the Holocaust. You must bring Manfred. Now, I've never heard of Manfred, and yet first thing I did was look him up on YouTube. Watched a video, watched another video, and I discussed it with Rabbi Litwin, and I said, yes, Manfred Goldberg, that's who we have to get. Called up Manfred. First thing I said to Manfred was, I feel like I know you already. I've watched so many of your clips. I feel like I know you. I asked him, was he available? He said he was. We met him on Zoom. And one thing you'll see about Manfred, for those of you who don't know him already, Manfred Goldberg is a mensch. Soft-spoken, determined, eloquent, with a story that you cannot quite believe, but for the fact that Manfred is about to tell us. We are so grateful and honored and privileged that Manfred has agreed to join us this night to share with us some of the story. As he said to us just before, it's hard to condense 3.5 years of a story into an hour. But we'll do our best to try and pick up at least some of the elements of his story to share with you tonight, this night of Tisha B'Av. So welcome, Manfred. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
You're welcome.
I actually had the audacity just before we started to ask Manfred if he's actually fasting today on Tisha B'Av. Manfred, I don't know if you want to share with everyone what you just told me.
Well, what about this gentleman? I still don't have an open-air minion every morning. And there's one gentleman there who I think likes to earn brownie points up in heaven by sort of acting as my personal assistant. When I arrive in the morning in my car, I park nearby, he runs up to open the door, carry my Talisbag for me, and likewise when I return to the car after davening. This morning, he said to me in passing, you're not fasting, are you, at your age? As I said just earlier, I looked at him astounded. The idea of not fasting had never occurred to me. I said to him, of course I am. He said, well, your doctor gave you the clear. I said, what doctor? I don't ask shilas. I've always fasted, and Baruch Hashem, I have the ability to continue doing so. And as long as Almighty grants me a clear mind and the physical strength to continue, I will continue fasting, and I will continue educating young people, primarily non-Jewish sixth formers in non-Jewish schools, by telling them my testimony, sharing my testimony with them.
Thank you, Manfred, for that. I have to say, if it's okay with you, I want to give you a new title just before we start this event. I mean, as everyone can already hear, and they'll hear as we go through the next hour together, you've got this beautiful, rich radio voice you're polished and articulate in a way that I haven't met many survivors are able to express themselves. And to me, you're very much, it's in a very much a surreal way. And to me, I would like to call you the narrator of the Holocaust, if I may. You tell it in such a surreal way. And we respect so much that you take the energy to go back to these places in your mind. And I'm aware every time you retell the story, on some level, you have to revisit these places, and that can be traumatic and it can be difficult. And I want to just, if we can start by asking you to share with us, you know, many survivors after the war, they just shut away those memories and never revisit them. And I wanted to ask, to start off, if you could share with us when you first went back to those memories and had to revisit them on a public level to tell your story.
Well, quite amazingly, these memories seem to be in a separate compartment of my mind, which is immune to aging. Events which have happened to me much, much more recently are beginning to fade after a little while. But those experiences a lifetime ago are as clear today as they were 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And therefore, it is no effort for me to share them with audiences. It is just part of my life, but part of my life which seems to be preserved, proofed against age. I could not bring myself to speak about these experiences for many, many years, for decades. In our shul, we had an annual sort of pre-Tisha B'Av event, which was dedicated to Holocaust memorial. And they would ask a survivor each year to come along and speak. But I was a member of the shul, and the organizer happened to be a friend of mine. So year after year after year, he would ask me to speak at this event in shul. And it was unthinkable to me to do so. Furthermore, when my children began to grow up, they also knew my background and, of course, repeatedly asked me to tell them in detail just what had happened to me as a youngster during the war, more or less when I was their age. I was sent to the camp when I was 11, and I was liberated when I was 15. But I just could tell them a few generalities, could not go into any details. I was approached by two local rabbonim at some point who did not actually tell me off, but told me that I should consider it an obligation to inform the younger generation, including, of course, the younger Jewish generation, who many of them had only the vaguest idea of what the term Holocaust meant. My family, particularly my wife, also encouraged me. And one day I came home from shul and I told her that my friend Leo, who was the organizer, asked me yet again. I told him I'd ponder on it, but of course my mind was already made up to refuse. And my wife gave me a lecture saying I should think about it carefully, because it was possibly not justified refusing, particularly after I told her about the approach by two local rabbonim, including Rabbi Kimcher of Ner. So I slept on it, and the next morning I said to my wife, you know, Shari, I have thought about it and I'm accepting. I told Leo I would accept, and of course the moment I had done so, I began regretting it. But being a man of my word, once I had said yes, that was it. And of course, once my name was in the public domain, I was asked again and again and again to speak primarily to Jewish audiences. I spoke to one such audience, and the person in charge was a very dynamic young lady who told me she had been doing this for some years, and she had listened to about 10 survivors speak by now. And I mean, if I repeat this now, I feel a bit self-conscious, almost embarrassed, because what she said to me was that you're in a different league to most of them. You speak practically without an accent. You speak clearly, fluently, no hesitations. You seem to have a clear idea of what you wish to say. You must begin speaking to non-Jewish audiences. Until then, I had only spoken in shuls and very occasionally to private Jewish audiences, like JLE, for instance, or very occasionally to sort of more secular Jewish audiences, but never to a non-Jewish one. I was very hesitant. Then when she could not persuade me, she passed my name on to the Holocaust Educational Trust, and they arranged for someone to visit me at home and also began persuading me. They couldn't quite get me to agree, but I did agree to accompany a survivor speaking in a non-Jewish school, just to get the feel of it. And having done so, I decided I think I could cope with it, and I did. And I have been speaking for close on 20 years now to many thousands of school youngsters, mainly sixth formers, but also some younger ones. And in addition, I've also been speaking to many non-Jewish large firms like HSBC, Barclays Bank, NatWest, and not recently, just a matter of weeks ago, on Zoom already, I was asked to speak to a very large firm of accountants, and they were so impressed by the feedback that they eventually decided to make my talk available to all their 300,000 employees worldwide. None of them were compelled to listen to it, but it was fed via their internal network to everyone's computer, and all they had to do was push a button and they could listen to my talk. I have no idea how many have actually done so, but perhaps I'm somewhat kidding myself. I guess many thousands will have done so. I hope that sort of answers your questions of how I began speaking about my...
Yes, we're very glad that you have agreed and did agree. And I know that you've spoken to many audiences already. For those who have visited Auschwitz, there's one block. It's a very new block. It's the Yad Vashem block. I think it's block 27. When you go in, and it projects images on the wall of what life was like in Europe before the war. It's very emotional to see just normal people doing normal things. Can you share with us, Manfred, just some memories of yours? What was life like for you? A taste of Jewish life, maybe, in Germany before the war, before the Nazis, or even when the Nazis have come to power. What was just regular life like for you and your family in Germany?
Well, the Nazis in Germany came to power when I was only 3 years old. I was born in 1930, and the Nazis reached power in 1933. So my memories really all encompass the Nazi regime. I would just briefly tell you that the town I was born in is a town called Kassel. Both my parents were born in Poland into very religious homes. My father, Oliver Scholem, had spent years in yeshiva before he came to settle in Germany. And even then he was still a teenager, under the age of 20. My mother also came to Germany single to visit some relatives who had settled in Kassel. They were introduced, fell in love, and married, and settled in Germany. And I was born there in 1930, and a younger brother in 1934. There were two distinct Jewish communities in our town in Kassel. Altogether, there were around 5,000 Jews living in this town, which had a total number of inhabitants of around 250,000. So 5,000 Jews among 250,000 Goyim. But even these small numbers of Jews were divided into two distinct communities. The majority were German-born Jews, many of whom had lived there for generations. They were fairly assimilated, some totally assimilated. There were Reform synagogues where they played the organ on a Friday night, but many were still sort of religious, somewhat religious, but the vast majority of these German Jews considered themselves German first and Jewish second. I've heard it summed up as being German Jews of the Jewish persuasion, and they disliked the smaller community of Polish Jews because they were much more religiously inclined and also visibly more religious, and therefore there was very little social contact between the two. The Polish Jews did not attend the synagogues frequented by the German Jews. They opened their own small ones, a form of Stiebel. I recall quite clearly walking hand in hand with my father every Shabbos morning to one of these Polish Stiebler, where my father davened regularly. And that is one of my early memories in town. There really was very little social intercourse between the two Jewish communities. Our friends were mainly the Polish refugees who had settled. So there was only one Jewish primary school in our town to which every Jewish child was entitled to go, Polish background or German background, and I was enrolled in one of these, the only school in town. Soon after I began going there, already it became apparent that there were problems ahead, because the Nazis, in their quest to turn the whole country into Jew haters, not only carried on an ongoing, very intense anti-Jewish propaganda campaign, they believed that any lie, no matter how vile, would be believed if it was repeated often enough. And I'm sorry to say that they were proved right. Eventually, they did. It took a long time, but eventually they gained followers and became a force in the country. And they immediately established the equivalent of sort of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts organization. They were called the Hitler Youth. And these youngsters, after a while, they're almost forced to attend, because any non-Jewish youngster who refused to attend became suspect of being a friend of Jews or protector of Jews. So as a result, practically every young non-Jewish child joined the Hitler Youth, and of course they became infected, and sometimes they would waylay us, to ambush us on our way to or from school. And we had been severely and repeatedly instructed on no account to stop and fight. If anyone messed with us, to turn and run as fast as we could, because standing there to fight back could have very serious and chas v'cholila even fatal consequences. So as a child, I was already severely restricted. I had just Jewish friends in school, and that was it. There was not much of a social life. I know that practically all my parents' friends were religious Jewish families with children around my age, and that was our social life. Occasionally, my father would take me for a day out, and I recall on one occasion, on our way home, we ran into an enormous crowd of people, more or less blocking the pavement. And then we inquired, we of course by then didn't appear Jewish. My father had no head covering, just no kippah. He wore a hat, and I had no head covering. Then he asked what was happening here. He was told that Hitler was going to pass by in a car shortly. And such was the climate by then that having heard this, it was not safe for us to walk on. We stopped and pretended to be enthusiastic about it. And then my father put me on his shoulder so I could watch above the heads of people in front of us. And eventually we did see Hitler National pass by in a car, giving the Hitler salute. And of course it was reciprocated by all these thousands of people in the street. And extraordinarily, my father had to raise his hand in a Hitler salute in order not to stand out, not to expose himself to danger.
What a crazy story. It's funny, I've never heard you repeat. I mean, I've listened to a bunch of stuff from you. I've never heard you repeat that story, that you actually saw the evil man himself.
Yes, just fleetingly in passing, yeah.
Crazy.
He stood in the car,
So it's
smile on his face and his arm up, giving his salute. Yes.
So it's crazy. I mean, Rabbi Adam was trying to ask about the childhood. So it sounds like you didn't have too much of what we would call a normal childhood.
No, I'm afraid not.
No.
When I had my recent interview, it's Holocaust Memorial Day, on the 27th of January, the Buckingham Palace released a brief video of a meeting between my friend Ziggy Schipper and I, who first met the royal couple in Stuttgart some years earlier. I said to her that my real life really began age 16 when I reached this country. Until then, what I lived through, both pre-war and in the camps, was not what you would call a normal life.
Wow. So with permission, I'd like to sort of go through the not normal life a little bit more in depth here. So for many people, what they call the outbreak of the war was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And I just want to know if you could sort of, in your own words, share with us, first of all, if you have any memories of Kristallnacht as a young boy, and if you could just take us through that part of your journey through to you and when you and your mother and your little brother were taken to the first camp. If you could just take us through that part of your journey, please.
Yes, I do have some memories. Fortunately, just what I saw from our window. Of course, everyone knows that it was a pre-planned orgy. On that night, thousands of civilians, accompanied by military and also local police, they stormed through every town where there was a Jewish community, assaulted Jews in the streets, and they concentrated on looting and vandalizing all Jewish business premises. Many thousands of retail shops owned by Jews were totally random. Not so much random, that they more or less knew every shop that was Jewish owned, but it was vandalized and totally looted, and was not allowed to reopen afterwards either. So there were practically no Jewish premises left in town. At the same time, during that orgy of Kristallnacht, several hundred synagogues were totally vandalized, and the larger ones, which stood in their own grounds, were, after all the vandalism, finally torched. They were set on light. There was one such synagogue quite close to where we lived. It was one of those which had an organ playing on Shabbat, and therefore it was not used by any of the Polish community, practically all of whom were very religious people. And there's actually a story I can tell you. This synagogue was in its own grounds. I had never entered it before, but I was told that there was an organ there, and it was set alight, and was burnt out to such an extent that the building became dangerous to be left standing. So they demolished it. And 2 or 3 weeks after that event, we were still going to our Jewish school daily. We went in groups accompanied by adults in order to overcome the danger of being attacked by Hitler Youth. And one day, all the youngsters of that school, it was a primary school, so they were all young, the oldest ones were 12 years old, were ordered to march to that synagogue. Then we got there, we saw just a huge pile of rubble, and there were trucks there, and we were told to line up in a sort of chain fashion. The first child closest to the heap of rubble had to pick up a handful of sort of builder's rubble and had to pass it on to number 2, number 3, and so on. And the last one had to throw it onto the back of a truck. And they made us work in that manner for a whole day to try and get that rubble onto trucks to be removed from the site. That was all that was left of that synagogue. I remember it so distinctly because one child in the chain threw rather badly, and the rubble he threw hit me on the head and actually caused me an injury. So it's sort of doubly clearly embedded in my mind that was post Kristallnacht. During that night, not only did all I told you happen, but they began arresting a total of 30,000 Jewish men who were sent to concentration camps, which by then were opened already in Germany. Camps like Dachau and Buchenwald were opened years before the war began. And there was something quite remarkable that saved my father. We lived in an apartment block. There were 6 apartments in that block. As far as I know, there was only one of the Jewish family, whose name was either Rosenblum or Rosenberg, living in that apartment block. The rest were non-Jewish. Among these was one family, the husband was a policeman, a civil policeman in the town of Kassel. Now, he was not a Nazi, and my father had a very pleasant relationship. When they met on the stairs, they would have a little chat. And this policeman, a couple of weeks before Kristallnacht, met my father on the stairs. This is a story my father, Oliver Scholem, told me later. He stopped my father and said, "I can't go into details, but I am telling you that it would be in your interest to disappear for a few weeks." My father took the hint and did disappear, and shortly after Kristallnacht, some uniformed men came to our apartment, asked for my father. When we told them he was not here, they didn't believe us. They entered our apartment and searched high and low in case he was hiding. And thank God he had been forewarned, and that what saved him. They had come to arrest him as part of the 30,000 quota they had set themselves, apparently. After several weeks, when they had reached their 30,000 who had been sent to the camps, they stopped arresting Jewish men, and it was safe for my father to return. So it was this non-Jewish policeman who saved my father from being arrested.
Wow, so that's Kristallnacht. I'm just wondering. So fast forwarding from like liquidation to the first. Yeah. I mean, it started with a ghetto, or how did that?
Yes. We lived a very restricted life. There were many restrictions already on Jews. There was only one shop Jews were permitted to enter. We weren't allowed to enter any non-Jewish shops, and of course there were no Jewish shops left in town. There was just one shop in town, which was designated as a Jewish shop, where we had to do all our shopping. And whatever that shop ran out of or did not stock, we had to do without. Well, life went on. It was very difficult, but in this manner, we continued to exist, restricted as we were. My father was not allowed to run his business any longer, but some of his customers were on such a personal relationship with him that even though it was dangerous for non-Jewish Germans to do business with Jews, some customers would come to the house where my father kept a stock of things he was selling, and they came to buy from him because they regarded him as a fair and good man who treated them well, and they took a risk and came actually to our private home to continue purchasing, despite being forbidden by the Nazis to do so. Eventually, around mid-1939, my father was arrested and deported to Poland. But he had left Poland more than 20 years earlier, and when he reached Germany, he gave up his Polish nationality. The Poles refused to accept him because they no longer considered him Polish, and the Nazis then detained him. My mother, Olea Sholon, courageously visited this Nazi office in Kassel, who dealt with deportations, and pleaded for my father's release, but she was told that the only possibility saving him from being sent to a concentration camp was immediate emigration. But getting a visa was absolutely impossible. It was a very different climate to what you experience nowadays, when tens or hundreds of thousands of refugees roam the world and find asylum and shelter in many countries. In those days, practically every country had tightly closed borders, and the few that did have annual visa quotas imposed such difficult conditions one had to meet before meriting one of these life-saving visas, that it was only a very slow trickle of Jews who could leave Germany. Let me give you just one example. The USA had a waiting list in 1938 of more than 300,000 Jews wanting visas. They had an annual visa quota of 30,000, but they imposed such difficult requirements to qualify for a visa that in 1938, with that long waiting list, they issued only 27,000 visas. They did not even issue their full quota. That is how difficult it was to actually qualify for a visa. Sometime in 1938, the American President Roosevelt called an international conference, more than likely to deflect criticism from America. 32 countries gathered in France to discuss how to assist German emigration. They talked for 2 weeks and achieved absolutely nothing. And in fact, far from helping Jewish emigration, I would not be surprised if that public display of total indifference to helping to save Jewish lives by assisting people who are desperately in fear of their lives looking for shelter might have convinced Hitler that in fact this indifference gave him the green light to go ahead with his final solution plan and continue building his extermination machine.
Wow. Manfred, so I'm hearing that, so your father had this whole situation, your mother miraculously, don't ask me how, nothing makes sense in this whole story.
That's right. She miraculously received a visa from the British chief passport officer at the British passport office in Berlin. Time does not permit me to go into detail, but if any of you are really interested, you can go online with the name Frank Foley, Foley, and you'll be rewarded with a heartwarming story. He issued a single visa for my father immediately to have permission to enter the UK, and gave my mother a promise that within a matter of a few weeks he would be able to issue visas to the rest of his family to join my father in England. The Nazis insisted that my father leave England within 24 hours, which he had to do. He left on the 20th of August 1939, and in two weeks later, the Second World War began, and we, the family, were now trapped in Germany.
Yeah. So while it's beautiful and it's special that your father managed to get out, it meant that with the outbreak of war, little Manfred with little Herman was left alone just with your mother, and then, deportation.
So the Germans allowed us to continue living in our apartments, but life was extremely difficult. They passed a law, for instance, that all non-Jewish firms had to dismiss all their Jewish employees, no matter how satisfied they were with them. And since Jews were not allowed to do any business in their own name, and now those working for non-Jewish firms had been dismissed, there was no practical way for any Jewish family to earn a living, which caused much hardship. Our Jewish school was closed. Jewish children who attended non-Jewish schools were dismissed. Lawyers and doctors were forbidden to have any non-Jewish clients. We were not permitted to have a radio in the house. All Jewish-held driving licenses were invalidated, so there was no driving. We were not permitted to have a bicycle. We were not permitted to go to a cinema. We weren't allowed to enter public gardens. But we managed to carry on in this very difficult manner until in December 41, there was a ring at our door. Two uniformed men told my mother that she had 10 minutes to pack a case for us, and we had to accompany them. They walked us to the railway station, where we met another large crowd of Jews already assembled, each one accompanied by a suitcase. And eventually, around 1,000 of us were packed into a train, and we set off on a journey into the unknown. We had not been given any destination. We traveled for 3 days. No food was offered to us. Fortunately, most people had packed some food. The train stopped each day. We were not allowed to leave, but through doors and open windows of the train, we were offered glasses of water on this journey. Then we were ordered out of the train after these 3 days traveling. We found that the place we had reached was much, much colder. There was thick ice and snow on the ground, and we were now surrounded by armed guards. They formed us into a long column. They told those who looked a bit weak that they could leave their luggage here. It would be put into trucks, and it would receive it at the end of our trip. Some people, many people in fact, did, and they never saw it again. My mother, Alea Sholem, continued schlepping our case, and we were taken into a part of a town which was surrounded by a large barbed wire fence. We soon found out that it was the town of Riga. We were marched into it, and the doors of around 40 houses were opened, and we were told to find ourselves somewhere to stay. We rushed in, and my mother, quite shrewdly, was one of the first to enter the house and found a very small room which was not possible to house any more than 3 of us, because it turned out that around 25 people were allocated to each house, and it meant that 2 or 3 families had to share a single room, sleeping on the floor. We had this tiny room to ourselves because it was not physically possible to have anyone else. The next morning, an SS officer addressed us, told us that we no longer possessed names. We were each given there and then a number which we had to remember. It was not tattooed on our arm, but forgetting it in due course led to punishment. I can tell you my number right now. I will not forget it as long as I live. 56478. That was my number. He also told us that if we possessed any jewelry, money, or other valuables, they had to be handed over to the Nazis within 7 days on pain of death if we were caught with any after that date. He also told us that anyone over the age of 12 had to go out to work. We would be formed into work groups, marched to work in factories producing goods to help the German war effort, and then marched back into the camp in the evening. Children under the age of 12 were exempt. I now had to begin looking after my little brother. I was aged 11, he was 7. My mother had to line up to be marched into a factory. She worked on a sewing machine, manufacturing army uniforms. Other people worked in different factories, making bullets, guns, many different items, but all specifically designed to help the Germans fight their war. Well, it was not easy for us children to be on our own all day long, and we sometimes run into trouble. We used to kick a football around to pass the time, and we found sledges in the ghetto, and it soon became clear to us by hearing first-hand evidence, I'll tell you in a moment how, that this ghetto had been occupied by close to 30,000 Riga Jews. The Nazis set out to form this ghetto, to build it. It was just putting a wire fence around a part of Riga town. And then they compelled every Jew living in Riga, of whom there were nearly 30,000, to leave their homes and move into the ghetto. They were allowed to take certain possessions with them, and not more than 6 months or so later, the Nazis decided to liquidate these 30,000 Riga Jews. They lied by telling them that they would be taken to another camp, and in groups marched them to what the Jews thought was the journey to another camp. In fact, they took them into a nearby forest where, by using slave labor, they had dug 3 enormous pits, and as each group of Jews approached, machine gun fires murdered them, and they either fell into one of these pits or were thrown into it. And in a matter of days, they had murdered all 30,000 Jews. The ghetto was now totally empty. Incredibly, 30 Riga Jews, whose prime claim to survival in the German eyes was that they spoke fluent German, were allowed to survive. And these 30 young men were appointed internal camp police in our ghetto. And it was they who told us of this atrocity firsthand. They were personal survivors who witnessed it. The ghetto began filling up by transports of Jews arriving more or less at weekly intervals from different towns in Germany. It was not easy looking after my brother, and among our group who were sent from Kassel to Riga was one teacher from the Jewish school which I had attended. He was an extraordinarily dedicated man, and he was extremely concerned about these children roaming around the streets of the ghetto and getting into mischief. And he began pleading with the elders of the ghetto, who had been appointed by the Nazis, for the use of one room where he could assemble all the children from our town, from Kassel. It took time, but eventually he succeeded. And all of us children were asked to assemble every morning in that large room where this gentleman, the teacher, whose name was Bacher, I don't know his first name, we addressed him, we all respected teachers highly. To us he was Herr Bacher. Herr equivalent is Sir. So the sensible translation would be Mr. Bacher, but it was more respectful than Mr. even. And he assembled us and attempted to teach us by dividing us into several age groups, a few years in each group. But it didn't work very well, because when he had no facilities for teaching. When he tried to pass on knowledge from his head into ours, when he spoke to the older ones, the younger ones began running riot, and soon he gave up on that idea. But he was a remarkably talented as well as caring teacher, and he had the idea of forming us into a choir, which of course he could keep everyone's interest, from the youngest to the oldest. And he began teaching us melodies from our prayers, like Adon Olam, Yigdal, Yotzei from our Shmoneh Esrei, Nigunim from Hallel, and so on. And he was quite successful. Eventually, he even divided us into groups to harmonize differently. And we became quite a passable choir. And of course, it met his prime objective of keeping us out of mischief. We spent most of the day with him, and in the afternoon, late afternoon, then we were released. My little brother and I would run to the entrance gate of the camp to await my mother's return. So, then I reached the age of 12, and my 12th birthday had passed. This gentleman teacher, Herr Bacher, approached me and said, "Look, I know your father is not with you, and your bar mitzvah is approaching. Would you like me to teach you?" And in a way, it should be embarrassing to me, but it's not. I'm just being honest with you. I admit I didn't really know what bar mitzvah meant. I'd stopped going to school before I was 9 years old. The school I went to was a Jewish school, but it was originally founded by the German Jews, who were not, how should I put it, tzaddikim. They were sort of frum, but as I said, German of the Jewish persuasion. So it was really an ordinary school for Jewish youngsters, and there was a little Jewish teaching. I was taught to write Hebrew, which I more or less knew by age 9. But I didn't know, looking back, very much about Jewish life. So then I said yes, because I was a good boy. He was very happy, and he had in his head calculated way ahead, around a year ahead, which would be, in his estimation, my bar mitzvah parsha. And initially he began teaching me just one parsha of the whole Sedra. But when he found that I was learning quite fast, he began teaching me the whole Sedra of Tzav, which he had decided was my bar mitzvah parsha. And when he had taught me that, he told me that it was, in his estimation, also Shabbos Parshas Poro, and he taught me additional laning and the correct Haftarah for Parshas Para. And when it came to my Bar Mitzvah Shabbos, there had never been, to my knowledge, a minyan in the camp. We had to work 7 days a week. Quite miraculously, 10 men turned up on that Shabbat morning. I have no idea how they managed to organize this, but we had a proper Shabbat morning service. I did the laning, and what may really surprise you is that we had a Sefer Torah. The background, of course, is heartbreaking. When the Riga Jews were permitted to take personal things into the ghetto, possibly some of the very frum ones, and certainly practically every Rav of a shul in Riga took a Sefer Torah with him into the camp. And when they were taken away to be murdered, they were not allowed to take anything. All their possessions were left in the ghetto. We occupied the same rooms that they had been in, so we found all their possessions, including Sefer Torah, and many Sforim. And our teacher, Herr Bacher, had managed to get hold of a Sefer Torah, and I learned from the Sefer Torah. And actually experienced a bar mitzvah. It was, of course, a very emotional experience for me, although I didn't fully understand the milestone it was in my life. In retrospect, of course, I do. And I will never forget Herr Bacher as long as I live. I actually caught a glimpse of him about a year later. He was standing on a platform to be transported in cattle trucks, of course, to another camp. And way down stood another group of Jews waiting to be transported to some other camp. And from a distance, I spotted that Herr Bacher was one of the other group. He recognized me, but all we could do was to wave to each other from a distance. And that was the last glimpse we had of each other. I actually was searching for him post-war, but I think he did not survive.
Manfred, that's an amazing and very emotional story. We're going to move on. You've already mentioned to us about your brother Herman, your younger brother Herman. I think we have a picture here of you and your younger brother.
Yes.
That's you on the left and Herman on the right.
Yes.
Can you share with us that fateful day that you were separated from Herman and the journey of hope and searching for him? And we know that for many years you always had the belief that you would see him again after the war. And what happened with that journey?
Yes, that was so. We were in a camp where every single person in the camp had to work to stay alive. And I made one exception. They allowed 4 youngsters, including my little brother, to stay in the camp. My mother and I became part of a slave labor group who had to be taken daily under guard to a nearby busy rail junction, which the Allies had begun bombing because they realized its importance to the Nazis. And our group was used to dig up the bomb-damaged rails and relay the new rails to make it serviceable again, because the Nazis needed it to supply their troops on the front line by rail. That was why the Nazis needed it so urgently, and that's why the Allies bombed it repeatedly. We came home from work one day and found that these 4 children had disappeared. Eventually, a member of the kitchen staff told us that 2 SS men had come into the camp that day, said they had orders to pick up these children and had taken them away. And that day, they disappeared off the face of the earth. We couldn't make any inquiries. In fact, life was so cruel that the next morning, both my mother and I had to line up and go out to work as though nothing had happened. Post-war, of course, we made inquiries ongoingly for year after year after year in the hope of finding out his fate, but absolutely successlessly. We could not find out anything. As I said, those children just disappeared. And from what we know of the Nazis, they certainly had no use for non-productive Jews. And odds on, these children did not survive the day they were taken. Nevertheless, after our liberation, years later, I refused to accept that he had been murdered, particularly as I intermittently, very occasionally, you either read in a newspaper or heard of some miracle where family members had met. I heard one such story of a lady in Israel taking a taxi, and she got chatting to the taxi driver, and it emerged that this was her son who had survived, and she'd been searching for him, and they found each other in this miraculous manner. And I kept hoping and praying that somehow, by some miracle, he might have survived, and the Almighty willing, at some point we would be reunited. In fact, I believed it so strongly that I refused to say any memorial prayer for him ever. At one point, it was suggested to me I ought to ask a Shaila. I did. I asked the Diane Rappaport in North London, and he said to me that at that time I was justified in not having given up hope. But I continued it quite unreasonably for around 70 years. Eventually, hope began to fade, and eventually I had no alternative to admitting that my hope was baseless, and indeed my brother had been murdered. And since then we have picked a more or less random date. I actually spoke to our Schulrav about it, and we commemorate his yahrzeit now. He has no grave, no known grave. We have no date. So we can just remember him in that manner. Finally, when I leave this world, I'm the only person who knows he ever existed, and he'd be totally forgotten, except it didn't quite work out that way. This is sort of really marching forward, missing out things you might want to ask me on. But in July 2017, I was asked out of the blue to return to the last camp we had been in, the camp of Stutthof, to meet up with a young royal couple, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, Prince William and Princess Kate. When I came to England in September 46 to be reunited with my father, my mother and I got permission finally to join him. It was a bittersweet reunion because we were no longer a family of four. My little brother, of course, missing. But as I said, that was practically the beginning of normal life. And I was extraordinarily fortunate in that I was almost unique, probably one in many hundreds of thousands who had survived the camps, 3.5 years of them in 5 different camps as a teenager. And I now had a home. I had 2 parents alive. And that was practically unique. I've known many young survivors, none of whom, to my knowledge, had both parents, or most of them, in fact, were orphans. A small, very small number had one parent alive, brother or sister. But I was extraordinarily lucky, and it helped me immeasurably to return to a life of normality, having this home that cared for me. My parents deprived themselves of many things to give me a chance to catch up on 7 years of lost education. And I finally decided that I wanted a forward-looking life, and I never ever went back to any of the camps where I had been. I'd never set foot in Germany since I left to come to the UK. And then out of the blue, I received this request to return to this most brutal and deadly of all the camps I'd been in, Stutthof, to meet this royal couple. It took me a lot of agonizing thinking, but eventually I decided it would be cowardly, more or less, to refuse. And I said I would agree to go and meet them. I asked for time to think, and it took me days before I gave my answer. So we met the royal couple, and as I said, they were an extraordinarily charming couple. It was a very emotional visit, and quite incredibly, I found out on that visit, yes, here you see a photograph of the 4 of us we were delegated to guide them through the camp and tell them our story and answer any questions they had. And I learned something that I didn't know before, and that is that Stutthof was one of the rare camps where the gas chamber and crematorium survived. And I actually took the royal couple into the crematorium and showed them the crematorium ovens which burnt bodies 24 hours a day. They looked in pristine conditions. One felt one just had to light a match, light them up, and they were ready for action again. And the story I heard was, like in every other camp, the Nazis, of course, intended destroying this evidence, and they laid dynamite around them, but set them on a timer to explode after they had finally evacuated the camp, right at the end of the war. And the timer turned out to be faulty. Only a tiny section of it actually exploded and damaged the crematorium, but not seriously. So Stutthof, in fact, is one of the very, very few, if not unique, camps which still has a gas chamber and a crematorium as evidence of what took place in that camp. And yet, in our lifetime, first-time survivors, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have been brainwashed into becoming Holocaust deniers. You may remember a court case where someone called Irving claims to be a historian, who took a Jewish academic to court for calling him an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier. And the court found in favor of the Jewish historian, saying she was justified in calling him that.
It's funny, Manfred, it's funny you mentioned that, because literally 1 year ago to the day, in your seat, we had the privilege of interviewing Deborah Lipstadt, that Jewish academic. So it was fascinating to hear from her. And it's I don't know, incomparable hearing from you. I am curious just to hear, I don't want to go back all the way, because I think it's beautiful how you just said your story in your way, and I couldn't help but, like, you know, well up a little bit when you spoke about the hope of your little brother Herman. You know, I've heard you say it before, but then hearing you each time say it, I can almost hear you revisit that part of your mind, sort of wishing and praying and hoping that it would have been. But I just want to know if you're willing, go on, sorry.
I was going to say, so I don't mean to interrupt you. Please finish what you're saying, and then I'll tell you.
No, please, Manfred.
I will tell you about one unintended, unforeseeable consequence of my visit to Stutthof. It caused incredible publicity. We were interviewed by dozens of reporters, and of course, they inquired about our background, and my name must have been mentioned. I must have mentioned the town I used to live in before being deported. And out of the blue, 2 or 3 months after this Stutthof visit, I was contacted by a group from our town in Kassel, who told me that they have dedicated themselves to placing memorial plaques outside the last known address of Jewish families who had been deported, and there would be a plaque for each person giving their name, the camp they had been deported to, and, if known, the date when they were murdered, or if they survived, it would mention that they managed to survive this deportation, the Holocaust. And they told me that as a result of the publicity engendered by this visit, they heard my name mentioned, and they also heard that we lived in Kassel. That was the first they knew that I had survived, and they contacted me to obtain permission from me to put 4 of these excuse me, normally I have a sip of water when this happens, but no such relief today. They told me that if I gave them permission, they would place 4 of these little brass plaques, 6-inch square. They're concreted into the pavement in front of the house in which the Jewish family lived when they were deported to the camps. It, again, was quite an agonizing decision. Initially, I wanted no memorial on German soil. The last thing I wanted was to be remembered by Germany. And after discussing it with family, we felt, they mainly, but they managed to persuade me, that, as I said, there is not a soul around in the world who would know this little child, the brother, my younger brother, ever lived. Let him have some memorial. He didn't have a matzeva, he didn't have a grave, we don't even know where he was murdered. Let him have a little 6-inch by 6-inch memorial with his name on. Maybe in passing somebody will stop and read his details, and it may actually trigger something in their minds, and they may give it some thought, or maybe even try to find out what happened to this family Goldberg, their background. And I agreed. They invited us for the sort of commemoration ceremony, and both my wife and I and all our sons, we have 4 sons, came with us. We made our way to Germany. It was the first time in 2018 that I set foot on German soil after I left in 1946. They permitted me to make the memorial speech in which I told them of my hope, of my little brother's survival, that for all these years I had not given up hope and had not said any memorial prayer for him. And on this occasion, I actually recited aloud a Kel Mole Rachamim in his name, and that was the first memorial prayer I ever uttered in his name, more than 70 years after, presumably, he met his death at the hands of the Nazis.
Wow.
And that is his memorial.
Yeah, but Manfred, not just that also, I mean, there's many people listening today, and many people that I know you've spoken to, must be thousands and thousands that have, for sure, been inspired in Herman's memory. And I'm sure this event is as well. I want to just ask you to go back a teeny bit. We're not going to go back all the way because I've listened to your story, and we could literally go on till the fast is out, till the early hour. I just want to ask you to go back to Stutthof, because I know you described Stutthof as, I think you called the entrance the gates of death. And I want you if you could share with everyone a little bit about what life or not life was like in Stutthof, and then your journey to the liberation, which was a very unique journey I've never actually heard before.
Incidentally, let me just tell you briefly that I have had letters from Germany from people who heard that talk, because it was recorded and it appears in a film called The Last Survivors. This thought of mine that not many people will stop to look at this plaque. And I've had letters from Germans saying that I was mistaken. People pay attention to these plaques and stop. And there was one lady who wrote to me that she thinks of him frequently because she was so emotionally taken by what she read, and then saw in that film called The Last Survivors. So I was somewhat mistaken, apparently. People do take notice of it. But going back to Stutthof, yes.
And indeed, just to add in, I'm gonna butt in one time as well. I've actually had people messaging me while you're talking how taken they are from your brother, the story of your brother. So there's another time we're proving you wrong, if that's okay.
Yes. Stutthof indeed has the main entrance gate, which was known in those days already during the war as the gate of death, the death gate. In fact, the royal couple stood next to it when we had our photo taken, and Prince William commented on it because there was a plaque next to the gate which explained that it was known even during the war as the death gate, because once you entered Stutthof through that gate, it was in effect a sentence of death. Very few people left Stutthof alive. You either worked to death or you died of starvation or sickness, but it was usually the end of the road getting to Stutthof. Well, we were in Stutthof twice. The first time, when we were sent to Stutthof, we became the envy of the camp when it became known that just that workers group, the slave labor worker group of 300, was in Stutthof in transit. And 3 weeks later, we were sent to another labor camp where we again had to do exactly the same work, repairing bomb-damaged rails. We have become a valuable source of labor for the Nazis, which allowed us to survive and leave Stutthof alive. We stayed in that next camp for some months, sent to 2 other camps, and then we were returned to Stutthof yet again by the end of 1944, early 1945. Stutthof by then was beginning to show the strain of the Germans sort of losing the war. We didn't know, we had no idea how the war was going, but it would not run as trimly as it had been the first time we were there. Initially, it was a very brutal camp, but many people, nevertheless, were taken daily to work in factories. By the second time I was there, only a very few people went to work. Most of them were extremely weak and were not working, just staying around the camp all day long. In fact, every night people died in their bunk beds, and there was a group set up in our barrack where we had to sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, so overcrowded was the camp, that had to check every bunk and lift out any bodies they found of people who had died that night, take them out to the front of the barrack. Another group of Jews pushed a cart around the camp, picked up the bodies and wheeled them to the crematorium for burning. That was Stutthof, the second time we were there. It had a high voltage electric fence around it. In addition, there were guard towers manned by armed guards. They had an obsession about stopping people escaping, although they were murdering them by the 100,000. Well, some people actually turned into just living skeletons, and they just could not take the punishment any longer and decided to end it by attempting to shuffle towards the high voltage fence to electrocute themselves. But very few, in fact, made it because it was forbidden for us to approach the fence. And as they did, usually they were spotted by an armed guard in the watchtower and they were shot. They achieved their aim of ending their suffering, but not quite the way they had intended. That was Stutthof, the second time we were there. Though both my mother and I managed to stay alive, she was in a different camp. The women's camp was adjoining the men's camp. Although I was only 14, I turned 15. My 15th birthday was in Stutthof. We did not know each other's fate on a daily basis. What we both did, sort of spontaneously, was to walk to an open area close to the division fence between the men's and the ladies' camps, and sometimes we could spot each other from a distance. We weren't close enough to speak to each other, because once you got closer to the fence, the guard in the watchtower would level their gun at you and yell if you didn't march back smartly. They would shoot you. But it was enough for each to see that the other was still alive. We could just see each other, not speak. On the 26th of April, in both the men's and women's camp, several thousand people were set aside, formed into a long column. Each one of us was given a chunk of bread, roughly half a loaf of bread, and we were told to march out of the camp through that death gate, accompanied by armed SS guards. And the 2 columns of men and women met outside the camp and marched as one long column. Neither my mother nor I knew whether the other had been selected for this march, so we began sort of wending our way through the column. Both my mother did and I did, and it took quite a long time. Eventually we spotted each other. To our great joy, we were still together. Although we didn't know what fate had in store for us, at least we would experience it together. We marched the best part of the day. We reached a small port, and we were packed into 4 ancient wooden barges. They were barely seaworthy. They were open-bodied inside, the type you might fill with coal, which you want to transport in bulk. But this time, we were the load. We were packed into the bottom of these barges. 4 tugs appeared, which were manned by SS teams, and they towed us out to sea. We were towed around sea for 6 days. On each day, at some point, an SS officer appeared at the top of the barge. He would look down, select a person. That person had to be dragged up if they resisted onto deck, and then we would hear a scream and a splash. On his orders, that person had to be thrown into the sea to drown. And he didn't stop at 1 or 2 or 3. He didn't have his fill until around 25, 30 people never had lost their lives that day. And this gruesome spectacle was repeated day after day for 6 days. In addition, every second day, the tugs would uncouple and disappear for a few hours, not long, 2-3 hours, and then they came back, recoupled, and we continued our journey. Apparently, we were never far out to sea. This was the Baltic Sea we were traveling on, but they traveled sort of around 1 kilometer or so from the shore, parallel to the shore. They dragged us along the sea in that manner. On day 6, the tugs went off again in the morning, but did not return after the usual period of around 2 hours or so. We had no watchers, so all this is an estimation. After some time, a group among us, we were not only Jewish, practically half our group were non-Jews, who consisted of anti-Nazi Germans, Polish resistance fighters, and prisoners of war. And I did not know then, but I do know now, that these non-Jewish prisoners had been fed a much better diet than the Jews received. And as a result, they were in much better physical shape. Now, as they were in reasonably good physical shape, a group of them clambered up on top deck and did something quite extraordinary. They managed to lever off some planks of wood, and they formed themselves into sort of a rowing team who attempted to row our barge to the shore so that we could get off in shallow water. Of course, it's almost an impossibility. There were around 1,000 of us on each barge, and for them to try and move us the best part of 1 kilometer to the shore seemed an impossibility. We, of course, who were sort of wedged way down in the boat, couldn't see any of this, but messages came down from deck that this is what they were doing. And eventually a message came along that they had managed to turn the barge to face the shore. And then a second message that miraculously the boat had begun to respond ever so slowly. They rowed in that primitive manner for hours until they were utterly exhausted. But by then other people were so encouraged and enthused that the adrenaline began flowing and other teams began taking over. They rowed for all day long, for hours and hours. Night fell. There was no sign of the Nazi tugs returning. The boat began to move ever so slowly. They rowed right through the night, and close to dawn, we were told that the boat had now run aground, close to the shore, and people began clambering up on deck, and it meant plucking up courage to jump into the water and make one's way ashore. Many people had lost the will to live or were too weak to move and just remained sitting on the barge. But some of us, including my mother and I, clambered up on deck. I was scared, but my mother encouraged me to be brave and jump. We both of us jumped into the water and we made our way ashore. It was a black night. There was no moon and there was not a sign of habitation. We reached the land, but it was just a large area of seashore, sandy shore. People were confused. They didn't know which way lay safety. There was no habitation, not a single electric light showing, and people had no idea, do we walk straight in, turn right, turn left? Which way would it be safer? My mother and I actually began to search for seaweed, just to chew something and get it into our tummy to still our hunger pains. As I told you, during those 6 days, apart from the chunk of bread, we had not been fed anything, nor given anything to drink. And it's while we were sort of stalemate, people had different ideas what to do. Then, extraordinarily, those SS-manned tugs returned. They, of course, were livid with anger at seeing what we had done, and they divided into 2 teams. One mounted the barge, and we could hear incessant shooting. A second lot came ashore and began rounding us up, and we felt sure, hearing that shooting, that we would be next, and that's how they would rid themselves of us. But no, we were mistaken. They lined us up into a group, a column, marched us under their guard. Anyone who didn't have strength to keep up with the tempo, and our guards were healthy people who could walk at a reasonable pace, but if we couldn't keep up, people began trailing. They were mercilessly shot. Their bodies just left where they fell. In this manner, we had to keep marching, constant shooting at the rear, as people just could not move another step. We saw a tank column coming towards us, and as it came closer, quite suddenly, these guards who moments earlier had still been killing stragglers, suddenly turned and began running for their lives away from us in the opposite direction. And as the tank column came nearer, we realized that they had recognized long before we did that it was an Allied, a British tank column, and they ran off to save themselves. And that tank column, by passing us so close on the same road, had in effect liberated us by ridding us of our guards, our killers. But that tank column did not stop. They had not come to liberate us. They passed us quite fortuitously by traveling along the same road that we were marching on. They moved past us, but a very short time later, we were absolutely flummoxed, not knowing what to do. We were in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what would happen next. There might be other SS coming up to us and beginning to kill us again. But truckloads of British soldiers appeared, and they stopped and took care of us. They called up truckloads of food, which they distributed among us, and they marched us gently, after allowing us to rest, into the nearest town, which was not far, a town called Neustadt, which contained a huge army training school or naval training school. The inmates, the German soldiers, had all been taken prisoners of war. They marched us into that compound, and it was rather like a Purim story, where in the morning Herman was second to the king, and by the evening fate had taken care of him. He was hanging from a tree, and by the evening we were masters of that army compound. We were lodged in the beds, sleeping in beds which they had occupied the night before. And that was our liberation. I could keep on.
Yeah, I know. Manfred.
Yeah.
The time is actually, it's unbelievable. Only 20 minutes until the fast is over. We've actually been inundated with questions.
Yes.
Now, we could answer all of them, but that would probably take us until tomorrow morning. So I'm going to just pick out one, just because I know you've got a lot to say on the matter. And then we're going to close with one question, and then we're going to say goodnight to everybody. So the question that I've chosen, and apologies to everybody else who I know has, everybody who has contacted me with questions. The question I'd like to ask you is, Manfred, just please, can you tell us, how did you meet your wife? And tell us a little about your wife and your children.
I'm going to butt in. I'm sorry, I'm butting in here because I don't know if you remember this, Rabbi Adam, but last week when we interviewed Manfred,
well, that's why I'm asking, Rabbi Litwin.
Yes, okay. I just want everyone to hear this. I asked Manfred, voluntarily had no idea what he was going to say. I said to him, tell us after the war, the most, I don't know, something special out of the whole story, the most amazing moment. And this is what Manfred said.
So, you're right, I'll find it difficult to be brief on this. First thing I'd like to tell you is when we finally received permission to join my father, Shalom, it was September 46, quite a long time. When we were interviewed initially by a welfare officer to whom we gave details of my father being in the UK. It took months, but they managed to establish contact between us. My father applied for permission, and it took more than a year before we finally rejoined him. And my father, although he was living in agony for 6 years, not knowing the fate of his family, had not experienced a crisis in his religious beliefs. He was the man he had been. He recognized that the Almighty is in charge of the world, and whatever happens to us is willed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he expected me, who was pretty ignorant in Jewish matters, just to accept his teachings and follow in his ways. Well, he began teaching me about tefillah. In fact, the first parcel he'd sent us to Germany, when he was waiting for us to come, contained a siddur and a pair of tefillin for me, as well as British cigarettes, which were the hard currency of the time. They would enable you to buy whatever you wanted. Money was worthless after the war, but British cigarettes did instead very well. Well, my father took me to shul with him on Shabbos morning. I remembered going as a little 8-year-old boy, but now I was going as a 16-year-old who was a Jew in his own right, post bar mitzvah. And when I began learning about the Jewish prayers, which were a total mystery to me initially, but when I began reading with translations what we were saying in our prayers, I just could not reconcile what we say in our prayers with what I had experienced. We call HaKadosh Baruch Hu a God of truth, of mercy, and kindness. And those were not adjectives, which, I don't know if they are adjectives, but they were not names which I could reconcile with what I had experienced from that same God. And although I could not break my parents' hearts by telling them that I didn't believe a word of this, I continued to be a Jew in appearance. I wore the kippah my father had given me, and I went to shul with him, and I sat there saying the words, but they were really meaningless to me. But as I began to mature, it became evident to me. I don't think it was sort of an inspiration. It was a slow, mature gaining of maturity. I began to realize that whether we like it or not, we experience miracles on a daily basis. If you look up at the sky at night, it is a spiritual experience, especially after I learned that the number of stars are barely countable, that there are not only millions but possibly billions of these stars out in outer space. You look at the seasons of the year. Trees begin to bloom in springtime, and what tells one tree to grow pears and another one to grow cherries or apples? I began to think about the miracle of birth, about the function of the human body. We eat food, it turns it into energy, and we have been given the ability to excrete the waste. What makes us breathe without any effort on our part? What keeps our heart beating on a daily basis so regularly to keep us alive? That this is not nature. It became clear to me that there had to be a God, a creator of the world. And judging how precisely run this world he created is, he not only created it, but he must be in charge of running it. And on that basis, I changed from a totally disbelieving Jew into a Jew who accepted that there is a God, but I still had problems in sort of squaring this with my experience. I could no longer deny that there was a God, but how was it possible for such a God to unleash such cruelty on innocent Jews? And then that really was a bit of an inspiration. It dawned on me that we are mere mortals. We come into this world, we live our lifespan, whatever God grants us, and then we disappear, go back to dust. But God, being infinite, everlasting, hoyo hove v'yeh, must be sort of a spiritual being with infinite ability to run this world. And he has treated us very kindly by giving us the power of thought and speech. But our minds are finite, just like our bodies. And I realized that there comes a point when we just cannot comprehend actions that don't seem capable of being analyzed by our finite minds. And I came to the conclusion that if God has not given us the ability to analyze these things, which must include the Shoah, the Holocaust, then it must be because he has willed it. And as I began to look through the Chumash in due course, and I think it was Sunday in Vayikro, where Moshe Rabbeinu pleaded with the Almighty, although he was the person closest to any human being has ever had relations with the Almighty, he still pleaded with God to allow him an insight into God's ways. And God replied, "My ways are not your ways." And that finally clicked something in my mind. And I realized that if God does not give us the ability to understand the Holocaust, it must be because he wills us not to. And that must be because he wants us to believe in him out of faith, not out of logical argument. And following that, I accepted not only that there is a God, but that if we experience the Holocaust, it must be a part of the Almighty's plan. If we are not permitted to understand it in this world, so be it. Maybe Efshe in Olam Habo we will have the privilege of getting a glimpse of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan and why it was necessary for us to experience this. And that was a major impact on my mind. It changed my life completely. And I moved into a different direction. It gave me a fulfilling life. And thank God that we have a wonderful God-fearing, religious family, children, grandchildren who are going the way I would like them to go after my conversion.
Wow. On behalf of everyone watching, Rabbi Edwards and everyone, I just want to say thank you, Manfred. It went on way longer than we expected, and I think we may have to do a part 2. I would just want to close with one phrase. I was going to close with a question. I just want to close with a phrase. I just want to quote something you said before. You said when you met your mother on the death march, you didn't know if either of you were alive. I think you said something like, although we didn't know what fate had for us, we knew we would experience it together. And I'm listening to the way that you're speaking about how you reconciled your relationship with Hashem. I feel very much, we don't know what fate has for us, but we know if we live with together with Hashem, then we'll be able to hopefully lead a life as meaningful as yours. Thank you so much, Manfred. And we wish you all the blessings that there are. Thank you.
Goodness, I'm astounded. I'm looking at a clock next to me. I have my mobile phone next to me to time me. And I realized with a shock that we've been on there speaking for almost close to 2 hours.
Yes.
Well past an hour and a half.
Yeah, I remember when we met last week, you said to us that normally when you have these meetings to prepare for an event, it's quite technical. Does the Zoom work? Does the Zoom not work? And I think you said, today I feel like I made 2 new friends. And I think that over today's event, I think you probably made hundreds of new friends out there. Your mailbox is going to be a lot busier, Manfred.
I reaffirm that comment I made last time about 2 friends. Yes, thank you.
The love is mutual. Thank you, Manfred. Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.